Hi, my name is Brendan Goldman. I am a associate faculty at the Strom Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington, as well as a historian of the Jews of the Islamic world. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth and final event in our Jews of Arab Lands series. We are grateful to our donors, many of whom I know have been watching the series, for their support. We would not be able to offer such fantastic programming without them. I'm also privileged to work with an amazing group of staff who have made this possible, including Sarah Zaydes-Rosen, Kara Schoonmaker, Grace Elizabeth D., Lauren Ben-Sussan, Jennifer McCullum, and Daniel Wang. And I should note that the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle is supporting this series as a result of granting a funding to Sarah Zaydes, who wrote the grant that actually enabled this to be possible. I'd like to invite you during the talk today to write in questions in the Q&A. I will look through them, and I will talk to the speaker at the end of the series to allow the speaker to respond to your questions. So this series is sought to offer a presentation of the cutting-edge research from young scholars working on the history of the Jews of the Islamic world, a period that spans over 1,300 years. We began with Hamza Zafar's study of Muhammad's Jewish wives, the Prophet Muhammad, and the formation at the period of the formation of Islam. We continued then to medieval Baghdad, a city of 1 million people when Paris was one of 5,000, that stood at the center of the world and where Jews lobbied at the caliph's court. Then last week we went to Algeria and jumped several centuries ahead to the French colonial period, when Jews and Muslims living under European rule struggled among themselves for European favor as well as for economic preeminence, and we got to see the sort of petty violence involved in those squabbles. As I told Alon Tam when we were speaking before this, I did not intentionally make the connection between Yuval's research and Alon's when I set up this series, but I think they really sort of beautifully run into each other. Alon Tam is a social historian of modern Egypt and its Jewish community. He has written about the social and political history of Cairo's coffee houses, about Cairo's Jews and their place in its urban history, as well as on topics ranging from the Jewish press in Tangier, Morocco, to Blackface in Egyptian theater. Tom received his Ph.D. from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. He has held several postdoctoral fellowships at Penn, Columbia University, the University of California in Los Angeles. He is currently on faculty at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev. I should note that our own Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures program, as well as our Israel Studies program, are co-sponsoring this particular talk. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Alon Tam.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for this very kind introduction. And thank you for organizing this. Thank you to the Strom Center for organizing this and all of the co-sponsors for having me in this series. It's really a pleasure of mine, and I'm very much looking forward to this webinar. And without further ado, let's start. And let's start by me sharing a few pictures with you. Right, I hope you can see that. All right. Okay, so such were the relations between the three religions, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, before the outbreak of Israel's War of Independence. Back then, no differences were felt, or any distress or hatred between us and them existed. Only respect and mutual appreciation, even tight friendship. This is how Maurice Uzon described the atmosphere at his father's coffee house, Ahwat al-Sharq, in Daher, Cairo, in the 1930s and 1940s. Even when tensions began to rise after 1948, his family's relationship with its Muslim Egyptian friends and neighbors remained strong, according to Maurice. In what follows, I will use Maurice's memories of public spaces in Cairo, mostly Ahawat al-Sharq, but also public parks and other places, as case studies to explore the kind of opportunities that they offered Jewish Egyptians and how they used those opportunities to assert their place in Egyptian society. It demonstrates how urban history can offer a unique perspective on the actual social meanings of Jewish identity in everyday life. What transpires most strongly from such a perspective is the centrality of social hierarchy to the urban Jewish Egyptian experience of that time. It was the emerging urban middle class culture obsessed with modernity and shared with Muslims and Christians that allowed Jews to carve out an equal place for themselves in Egyptian society. It helped them form strong social bonds with their neighbors across confessional lines, bonds that could withstand challenges, at least for a time. This microhistory relies on an interview that I conducted with Maurice Uzon in 2015 at his home in Bat Yam, Israel. On the few documents that his father kept and Maurice showed me, and on a short memoir that he published in the Journal of the Association of Egyptian Jews in Israel in 2006. As a form of historical anthropology, Maurice's testimonies capture everyday experiences and interactions, their meanings, as well as understandings of space and intercommunal relationship. This kind of information and insight is usually lost in other historical sources. As with all sources, life stories have their own challenges, and to mitigate them, I will closely deconstruct Maurice's testimonies and contextualize them within the urban history of Cairo and the social history of its Jewish community. So according to his 1926 Egyptian identity card, Shahata Ezra Uzon, Maurice's father, was born in Jerusalem. This meant that, like most Jewish Egyptians, he too had recently migrated to Egypt in search of a better life. Egypt's economy had been growing exponentially since the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the success of its cotton industry, and the inviting environment for foreign investment created by British colonialism. It attracted significant waves of migrations from the Middle East and North Africa, from around the Mediterranean and from all parts of Europe. The immigrants were of all stripes, big investors and small entrepreneurs, administrators and experts, skilled and unskilled laborers. At the same time, the economic boom and the industrialization of rural agriculture both pushed and pulled large wave of migrants from the Egyptian countryside to Cairo and Alexandria. The Jews among these immigrants fundamentally changed the makeup of the Jewish community in Egypt. From about 5,000 Jews there in the mid-19th century, the community swelled to around 65,000, according to the most conservative estimates in the interwar period. That is, more than a 13-fold increase in population that had far-reaching implications for the social history of that Jewish community. Most of the Jewish immigrants came from all over the Ottoman Empire, that is the Arab Middle East, North Africa, Anatolia, and the Balkans, especially Greece. And about 10% of the immigrants were Ashkenazi Jews from Russia, Romania, and Poland. Due to its geographical proximity and long shared history, back and forth migration between Egypt and late Ottoman or British Mandate Palestine, where Shahada Uzon came from, was also very common. Many, if not most, of the Ashkenazi Jews that I just mentioned came through Palestine, like the famous Ambash family, the family of the current Israeli president, Yitzhak Herzog, on his mother's side. Tens of thousands of mostly Russian Jews were deported to Egypt by the Ottomans during the First World War. Some remained there after the war, some returned to what was now British Palestine, and some migrated elsewhere. But the connections between Egypt and Palestine, and all the way back to the ancient land of Israel, if you will, were much more mundane than that. For example, one testimony of a member of the Yishuv, the pre-1948 Zionist settlement, tells how he popped on the train to Cairo to buy a wedding dress for his wife-to-be at the famous Sikurel department store, owned by Jewish Egyptians originally from Ottoman Izmir. Contrary to popular perception perpetuated by both Jewish and non-Jewish Egyptians, only about 25 to 30% of the Jewish Egyptian community actually had some kind of European citizenship, usually French, Italian, or British, or any kind of European legal protection. And even that number fell rapidly since the 1930s. The rest were either Egyptian nationals or stateless, usually of Ottoman origin. This made them Egyptians in the eyes of the law, as they did not enjoy the extraterritorial legal privileges and protections that foreign nationals enjoyed until 1937. Finally, it is important to note that Jewish immigrants to Cairo and Alexandria did not come only from outside Egypt either. Many Jews from smaller communities in the countryside were part of the big move to the cities. I should also note that most scholars of the Jewish community in Egypt have rarely considered its history in the framework of migration studies. I contend, for example, that Jewish Egyptian history has as much in common with Jewish American history as with any other Jewish community in the Middle East and North Africa. Egypt's economic boom offered most of those immigrants the opportunity to climb the socioeconomic ladder, either in their own lifetime or within just one generation in their families. This upward mobility fitted in with the rapid social changes that took place in Egypt from the middle of the 19th century. These changes included new groups carving out a space for themselves in the Egyptian social hierarchy, a growing wealth disparity between the different social classes, and the adoption of new lifestyles. Most of the Jewish immigrants to Egypt were part of that emerging middle class. Historian Gudrun Kremer estimated that as many as 60% of the Jewish community in the interwar period belonged to that social class, while about 10% were elite or very rich, and the rest were either in the lower class or very poor, Lumpenproletariat, as we call them. This social makeup was different from the larger Egyptian society, most of which remained lower class and rural at that time. The relatively small numbers of the Jewish community might explain this anomaly. Middle-class Jews were mostly merchants or commercial agents, bureaucrats in the expanding state apparatus, administrators, salespeople, craftsmen, and professionals. The elite were bankers, investors, big businessmen, and managers. And the lower and poor classes were laborers, peddlers, small artisans, and irregularly employed or unemployed people who lived on the community dole. It should be noted that in that period, even one middle income salary could provide a middle-class lifestyle for an entire family. The main socioeconomic strategies for reaching the middle class were working in retail and having good higher education, preferably in a French curriculum, but also in the modern Arabic one. As crucial as these socioeconomic strategies were, other sociocultural actions were also needed in order to be part of the Egyptian middle class, known as Effendiya in Arabic. It was, first of all, a very urban phenomenon. People living in rural Egypt could very well be rich as part of the landed aristocracy, or mostly very poor agriculturalists, but they were not effendis. Being an effendi meant an urban life, dressing in European style, and for men wearing the tarbouch, flaunting some use of the French language, either on its own or mixed with Arabic, having and enjoying leisure time by playing sports, using photography, listening to music, watching films, going to the theater, opera, or dance hall, avidly creating and consuming print products, especially newspapers, supporting an empowerment of women, changing how men and women interact in public, and emphasizing the nuclear family, believing in the global good of science and technology, and more. Effendis pitied this way of life, or habitus, to use the term coined by sociologist Bourdieu, as progress or modernity, against what they defined as traditionalism and backwardness, and associated with religion. This view was shared across almost all religious communities in Egypt, including its Jews. Now, to return to Shahata Ouzan's coffee house, Ahwat al-Sharq, this coffee house was located on a stretch of the famous Al-Khalig al-Masri Street, which is Port Said Street today, in the neighborhood of Daher. The Ouzan family lived not far away in a Sabri Street, also in Daher. And I should say something here about the urban development of Cairo in this period, because it provided the physical space, the public stage, if you will, for the Egyptian middle class to perform its new ways and styles, or its class identity. So although building outside the walls of Mamluk Ottoman Cairo had begun earlier, the expansion of the city since the mid-19th century was historically significant in both scale and character. The Khedive Ismail is usually credited with initiating this building spree following the economic boom of the 1860s, and also with determining its nature, that is, building a new city outside of the old one that would be nothing less than Paris on the Nile, quote unquote. Thus, the new neighborhoods he commissioned to the west were fitted with wide straight boulevards, squares, parks, European-style buildings, a modern opera house, theaters, even a circus and a zoo. Another wave of urban expansion, even more significant in scale, took place between the 1890s and 1920s. This time it was led by private interests with little government involvement, but according to the same modern and European-inspired blueprint. These new neighborhoods created new social realities. One was a class division. Whereas inside the walls of old Cairo, rich and poor lived together, the new expansions of the city were first and foremost a playground for the aristocracy and the rich. However, the economic boom allowed the emerging Effendiya, or middle class, to move into the new neighborhoods as well. In this way, a class division was inscribed onto Cairo's new map. The old city was inhabited by the lower classes and the poor, many of whom were also recent immigrants from around the country, while the adjacent new neighborhoods were populated by the Effendiya, and the rich built their villas on the banks of the Nile or in other suburban areas. The new neighborhoods were also home to many of the immigrants from outside Egypt. However, it should be noted that at no point in time did foreigners or expatriates constitute a majority anywhere in Cairo. Similarly, Jews were never concentrated in a single area of the capital. The only Jewish urban area popularly identified as such was Harat el-Yahud, or the Jews' Alley in Arabic, in Old Cairo. Most Jews, rich and poor, concentrated in Harat el-Yahud, where most of the synagogues were consequently located. However, many Jews lived in other parts of the old city as well. By the 1930s, however, only about 24% of Cairo's Jews still lived in different neighborhoods of the old city. These numbers represent both an exodus of Jews from Old Cairo to the new neighborhoods, as well as the multitude of Jewish immigrants that settled in the latter from the start. While the Jewish elite settled in the most affluent neighborhoods and suburbs, most Jews concentrated in the new middle-class parts of Cairo, especially those that were adjacent to Harat el-Yahud, to its immediate west and north. And I am talking here especially about Daher and Abbasiyah. And if you can see my cursor, so Harat el-Yahud is kind of here in the old city with its famous dozen synagogues, including the Rabam and Kampusi synagogues. And Daher is here to its northwest, as is Abbasiyah. And these would be the even newer neighborhoods like Ismailia. So most of the new synagogues built in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th were located in Daher and Abbasiyah, as well as the new Jewish schools, yeshivot, the religious seminaries, the community offices, and the Beit Din, the courts. The Jewish presence in Daher and Abbasiyah was conspicuous, but it did not turn them into Jewish neighborhoods. These areas were also heavily populated by Egyptian Copts and other Christian immigrants, who built their own imposing churches and schools there. Abbasiyah, for example, is still home to the St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Cathedral, which is the seat of the Coptic Pope. The majority of inhabitants in these neighborhoods, however, were Muslims. The difference then between Muslim, Christian, Jewish Harat el-Yahud in Old Cairo and Muslim, Christian, Jewish Daher, Abbasiyah, or Muski in New Cairo was not in their religious mix. The difference was in the socioeconomic class of their inhabitants, in their urban infrastructure, planning, and architecture. It was the difference between Ottoman Cairo and Paris on the Nile. This dichotomy, which did not necessarily correspond to reality, was central to the Jewish middle class mental mapping of Cairo and to the making of their own class identity. It has continued to be central in their collective memory of life in Egypt even after they left it. Jewish charity and social reform efforts were concentrated on alleviating the plight of the Jewish poor in Harat el-Yahud. Jewish newspapers of the time often described the area and its Jewish inhabitants as dirty, unhygienic, diseased, and shamefully indigent. They posed a problem for the middle-class Jewish community that needed to be fixed. Middle-class Jews who lived in the modern neighborhoods would not usually set foot in the strange Hara, unless for some religious ritual in one of the ancient synagogues or to buy matzos for Passover. It should be emphasized that Jews had picked up such class-based views of Cairo's physical and human geography from the non-Jewish society in which they lived, both from foreign visitors or residents, as well as from local Muslim effendis. Jews then understood Cairo as their Muslim and Christian neighbors understood it, a city whose physical, infrastructural, and architectural differences intersected with class boundaries and their concomitant lifestyles, rather than religious or ethnic differences. Finally, I should emphasize that by the 1940s, even Daher and Abbasiyya were already considered downtrodden and lower status in comparison to the even newer and more modern neighborhoods that were rapidly built westward toward the Nile, like Ismailia and Maadi and Heliopolis, which I showed you on the map. So Uzon's coffee house was then a lower middle class establishment located in the lower middle class majority Muslim neighborhood of Daher, not too far from Harat el Yahud, a neighborhood that boasted a conspicuous Jewish and Christian immigrant population. Uzon also owned an adjacent bar. Now, as you know, Jews and Christians in Muslim majority societies have long been associated with the manufacture and sale of alcohol, but conspicuous public consumption of alcohol was normalized in this period by the adoption of European practices and by the influx of immigrants. Alcohol was now openly consumed in the new bars, clubs, casinos, dance halls, and even in some coffee houses that spread around the new parts of Cairo. Thus, the sale of alcohol connects Uzon's bar to a long pre-modern history of Jewish association. However, in its socio-cultural practices, its physical design, and its position in the spatial context of the neighborhood, Uzon's bar was a thoroughly modern institution. Now, as for that spatial context, Ahwat al-Sharq was close to a well-known movie theater called Victoria, a Daher landmark that features frequently in testimonies of the neighborhood's Jews. Down the street, there were two other coffee houses slash bars slash casinos owned by two other Jewish Egyptians. One was Jamil, a family friend of the Uzons. And there were also Ahwa Baladia, or a low-class local coffee house, and a Buza place. Buza is an alcoholic drink made of fermented barley that was heavily associated with Nubian Egyptians. So except perhaps for the Ahwa Baladia and the Buza place, the other establishments around Ahwat al-Sharq were also part of and vehicles for modern life, entertainment, and sociability in Cairo. And they were all patronized by the neighborhood's lower middle class residents, regardless of religion. Moreover, Ahwat al-Sharq and its adjacent bar were also modern in their design. Uzon filled them with dozens of small tables and chairs, both indoors and outdoors. This spatial design may seem unremarkable today, but older coffee houses in Cairo used a diwan-style internal design, which you can see on the left, with floor-level couches running along the wall, or with long wooden benches, or mastaba in Arabic, in the poor ones like you see on the right. The cultural practices in Shahata Uzon's coffee house and bar were also emblematic of the Egyptian middle-class urban modernity. He sometimes hired an oud player to entertain his many customers in the evenings with the popular Arab Egyptian songs of the day. And he had a radio in the coffee house too, which would play maybe one of Kulthum's hit songs, which you have heard when you joined our webinar today. These kinds of entertainment replaced older ones, such as the storyteller or the hakawati in Arabic. As for food and drink, Ahawat shop offered coffee and alcohol, probably also strong tea, and the light fare of meze. These were all part of earlier Ottoman foodways, yet some of them were revamped in the 19th and 20th centuries. For example, the kinds of coffee that were served had changed. The French popularized the practice of sweetening the coffee. And as mentioned above, openly serving alcohol was also new. Uzon's staff and clientele were a mix of the neighborhood's Muslim, Christians, especially Greeks, and Jews. Uzon employed about 5 Muslim waiters and a barman, as well as a Jewish manager, while he himself used to move around between the tables, regaling the customers with jokes and funny stories. Most of those customers were men, although Uzon's wife usually occupied a large table in the coffee house for her and her female friends, much to Shahata's chagrin. It seems that a few women did frequent Ahwat al-Sharq, especially as part of family outings. There was an increased and visible presence of women in certain types of coffee houses during this period, and in itself it was a hallmark of changes in gender relations, changes that were ideologically associated with middle-class modernity. Indeed, coffee houses like Ahwat al-Sharq have mainly served as hubs for local social interaction and bonding. The neighborhood's Muslims and Jews sat together at the same table, drank the same coffee and alcohol together, ate the same meze, enjoyed the same music, and shared the same laughs offered by Uzon. Maurice remembers that special atmosphere, as he called it, with great affection, and I quote him again, "Back then, no differences were felt or any distress or hatred between us and them, Jews and Muslims, only respect and mutual appreciation, even tight friendship." End of quote. So most of Ozon's customers were Muslims, but there were likely more Jews and Christians who patronized his coffee house and bar than in other such places in Cairo, due to their higher numbers in Daher. This, however, did not make Ahwat al-Sharq a Jewish coffee house. Examining the role of coffee houses in the making of Jewish and Hebrew intellectual networks and literature, literary historian Shachar Pinsker posited the existence of Jewish coffee houses in Europe and in the United States. These were either Jewish-owned and operated coffee houses with a majority of Jewish clientele, or coffee houses largely patronized by Jews. In Egypt, however, there was no particular Jewish association with certain coffee houses, either by ownership, clientele, or other cultural markers. There were Greek coffee houses in that sense, especially in Alexandria, but there was no Jewish equivalent. Shahata Uzon, a coffee house owner, just happened to be Jewish, and a number of his customers, but not most, also just happened to be Jewish. The primary cultural and social markers of Ahwat al-Sharq were its modernity and its middle classness. It was contrasted with the Ahwa Baladia and the Buza place down the street. As an institution dedicated to sociability, Ahwat al-Sharq gave Uzon a certain unofficial position of power in the everyday social fabric of the neighborhood. Maurice described his father as a kind of Sheikh el-Hara. Before the turn of the 20th century, this was a formal position of power held by a neighborhood notable or strongman who mediated between the neighborhood's population and higher level state authorities. It no longer existed in mid-20th century Cairo, with the centralization of the Egyptian state and the expansion of its ability to reach individuals directly. However, Maurice's description echoes the informal power that his father had thanks to the networks and the close social ties that he carefully cultivated. For example, Maurice remembers when a new night watchman took his father into police custody for selling alcohol after midnight. Shahata was able to bribe his way out of trouble. This incident shows how important were Shahata's personal relationships with the representatives of state authority on the local or neighborhood level for the smooth operation of his businesses. It shows how easily such ties could be disrupted, but also how quickly they could be repaired and maintained. Shahata Uzon used his connections to help others with the authorities too. For example, he helped a Jewish female relative to extricate herself from an unhappy marriage to a Muslim man by facilitating her move to Palestine. Shahata Uzon's social power and position as a Jew among Muslims were put to the test in 1948 and afterwards. The rise of Pan-Arabism and Pan-Islamism in Egypt during the 1930s and 40s increased public interest in the escalating Zionist-Palestinian conflict. This interest, together with the exacerbating anti-colonial struggle against the British, resulted in certain groups of non-Jewish Egyptians associating all Jewish Egyptians with Zionism. Such tensions erupted into violent incidents against Jews in Cairo as early as 1945, and more so after Egypt's defeat in the 1948 war with Israel. Although such instances of violence were still limited in scope at this point in time, they were enough to cause many Jewish Egyptians to leave Egypt. These developments manifested themselves in the small world of Ahwat al-Sharq. Maurice recalls how certain groups of Muslim students from the nearby School of Commerce started to taunt and harass the neighborhood Jewish youngsters during this period. In one incident, they chased Maurice and his friends on their way back from a self-defense class in Daher's Maccabi Club. Maurice and his best friend Roni landed a couple of blows on their attackers before fleeing to Jamil's on his father's coffee house for protection. A famous Muslim wrestler called Mukhtar Hussein was present at the coffee house, rose to defend the Jewish friends and to deter the Muslim students. With Jamil, he diffused the situation and made peace between the two groups of youngsters over some free cold sodas. But in May 1948, another much larger group of Muslim attackers, railing against Zionists and Jews, managed to destroy Jamil's coffee house. Fearful groups of neighborhood Jews ran to Uzon's Ahwat al-Sharq for refuge. Shahata managed to close the door behind them and protect them from the assailants, while using his connections to call for help from the nearby police station. A police contingent arrived and dispersed the angry crowd. So these two incidents exposed the intricacy of Jewish-Muslim relations in times of heightened tension and violence on the everyday neighborhood level. Above all, they show how these relations withstood challenges that both frayed and enhanced Jewish-Muslim ties at the same time. The groups of Muslim students were ideologically and politically motivated to perpetrate acts of violence against the neighborhood Jews. However, at the same time, the two Jewish coffee house owners, Jamil and Shahata, used the close relationships they built with the neighborhood's Muslims over the years to quell that violence. Jamil by turning to a local Muslim strongman who was his client, and Shahata by calling on the local police force whom he knew. So coffee houses and bars were not the only spaces that offered Jews and non-Jews new opportunities to socialize in modern Cairo. One of Maurice Ouzon's best childhood memories involved some of Daher's Jewish and Muslim families going on a weekly excursion to the Cairo famous lemon gardens. The Orman Gardens, popularly known as the Lemon Gardens for its 10,000 citrus trees, were part of the much larger gardens of the Giza Palace built by Khedive Ismail in the 1850s on the western bank of the Nile, an area that was a playground for the Egyptian aristocracy and still is an affluent suburb today. Originally a 90 acres botanical garden that supplied all Khedive palaces with fruits and vegetables, by the time of Maurice's childhood in the 1930s and 40s, the lemon gardens were reduced to about 25 acres in order to make way for another icon of modern Cairo, the first zoo in the Middle East. But more importantly, these gardens were open to the public, and the Egyptian middle and lower classes used them for picnicking. This particular leisure activity also has a long history. Creating parks for leisure outside of cities can be traced back to the early modern period in the Middle East. But creating them within big cities, specifically for recreational purposes, was relatively new in the late 19th century. Some of these parks were clearly geared toward the middle classes, such as the famous Azbakia Park, built in the 1870s as a centerpiece of Cairo's new expansions. In its first decades, it was gated and required an entry fee, which limited access to the middle classes who could afford it. However, public parks with free access were frequented by the lower or lower middle classes. So Maurice remembers that every week, a well-to-do Muslim neighbor who owned a transportation company and was a close friend of Shahata Ouzon and a regular at Ahawat al-Sharq, provided the neighborhood's Jews and non-Jewish families a bus to take them to the lemon gardens for free. The grown-ups would spend the time picnicking with an abundance of food, chatter, and laughter, while teenage Jewish boys and girls would use the rare opportunity to socialize. Maurice only mentions here Jewish boys and girls pursuing each other, but the opportunity that the lemon gardens offered for youngsters of both genders to meet each other in a legitimate way very likely extended to non-Jews as well. Although considered a taboo in the Jewish community, many Jewish life stories from 20th century Egypt reveal that romantic relationships and marriages between Jews and Christians, and to a lesser degree between Jews and Muslims, were not uncommon. So coffeehouses and public parks were part of a much longer list of public places in Cairo that Jews used in order to fully participate in a kind of middle-class culture that neutralized but not erased their Jewishness. Take, for example, the high-end exclusive sporting clubs in Cairo, such as the Gezira Sporting Club or the Ma'adi Club. Like the public park that the Ouzons and their friends used to enjoy, these sporting and social clubs offered a new modern kind of outdoor leisure activity for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim families alike. However, there was a marked class difference between the lemon gardens and the Gezira or Ma'adi clubs. While lower middle class or even lower class families picnicked in the former, aristocratic or upper middle class families enjoyed tennis, golf, and dainty hors d'oeuvre served by uniformed waiters in the latter. Finally, it should be emphasized that there were also exclusively Jewish public spaces in Cairo beyond the obvious religious institutions such as the synagogues. There were, for example, Jewish sporting clubs like Maccabi, which had branches both in the affluent Cairo suburb of Heliopolis and in Daher. Upper middle class Jews established fraternities and sororities, such as the Bnei Brit and Deborah lodges, respectively, which took after organizations like the Freemasonry that became popular with the Egyptian higher classes in the 19th and 20th centuries. These places and others showcased a confident and affluent Jewish community. But rather than signal segregationist attitudes, they signaled Jewish integration into the urban fabric of Cairo. Not only did such places imitate non-Jewish ones, their Jewish members moved comfortably and frequently between them. Finally, and just for the sake of closure, let me come full circle and tell you the rest of the Uzon family story. As I've said, Maurice Uzon emphasized that his family's social bonds with Muslims remained strong despite the growing tensions and challenges after 1948. And I quote him again here. The friendship and loyalty that had been built over the years between my father and his Gentile friends, despite the religious differences, remained stable and unshaken until my parents left Egypt and made Aliyah, or migrated to Israel in 1952. So how did that happen? Well, as a teenager, Maurice himself joined a Zionist youth movement and emigrated to Israel alone in 1949 when he was 16 years old, one of only a few hundred Egyptian Jews to do so. His mother could not stand that separation, so under her massive pressure, as Maurice said, Shahata closed down his successful coffee house and bar, and they too emigrated to Israel 3 years after their son. This was also relatively early compared to the main wave of Jewish Egyptian immigration in 1957. Maurice's emphasis on the extremely personal motives of his parents' chain migration out of Egypt is commensurate with his emphasis on Shahata's success and strong social bonds in Cairo, despite the historical challenges. And finally, even this emigration did not sever the Uzon's ties to Cairo, at least not Maurice's. After the 1979 peace accords between Israel and Egypt, Maurice returned to Cairo many times as a tour guide for Israeli tourist groups. So to sum everything up, I argue that the urban history of Cairo's Jews in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th one is a story about migration, both to and within Cairo. It is a story about social hierarchy and social mobility, and about using the city to perform their newly acquired middle classness. Cairo's Jews participated in the actual mental and social remapping of the sprawling city, where a dichotomy was created between the old and the new, the backward and the modern, the poor and the rich. Uzon's Ahawat al-Sharq was not a Jewish coffee house, but rather a modern one, in contrast to the Ahwa Baladia down the street. In its architecture and decor, the food and drink it served, the entertainment it offered, and the lower middle class clientele it hosted, Ahwat al-Sharq epitomized an Egyptianized version of European-inspired modern social culture. Ahwat al-Sharq was a crucial meeting place for Daher's Jews and Muslims. It fostered strong social bonds between them that withstood tension and crisis and gave Uzon some social power on the local level as a facilitator. Other public spaces in the modern city offered its Jews the same opportunities, whether picnicking in the lemon gardens, sharing office space at work, being educated in either French or modern Arabic curriculum, playing in the same sports teams, meeting in the same social clubs or Masonic lodges, going to the same cinema theaters or dance halls. Jewish and Muslim Egyptians shared the same middle class or Effendi lifestyle. What was at stake here for those Jewish Egyptians, recent immigrants from often modest socioeconomic origins, was the opportunity to achieve and perform their modern middle classness without their Jewishness being an impediment. This must have been strongly appealing to them more than any ideology of equality, be it nationalist, communist, or other. So locating Jews and Muslims back together in the same spaces provides a fuller and extremely nuanced view of the bonds as well as the tensions between them. It does not shy away from the tensions. In fact, the story of Ahawat al-Sharq and the Uzon family shows how those tensions grew inside the neighborhood. They were not outside intrusions that struck an idyllic coexistence. But this story also shows how relatively quickly these tensions were resolved using the long-standing relationships that Daher Jews built over the years with the neighborhood's Muslims. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Alon. Do you want to unshare your screen, or is it unshared? We're
Yeah.
Perfect.
There we go.
Perfect. Excellent. Excellent. That was a fascinating talk. I think really captures the richness of an urban microhistory and what it can tell us about a period and about relations between different communities. I want to invite our audience to continue to send in Q&A questions. I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question, and then we have a couple already lined up. So as a social historian, one of the things that I was thinking about with this sort of idealized vision that Uzan had of Ahawat al-Sharq before 1948 or 1945, as it may be, is the violence of British colonialism, right? So there's an implicit violence that exists behind that quiet. And it's interesting because in some ways, your presentation today and Yuval's last week are two completely different sides of the coin. Yuval's presentation really focused on violence between Jews and Muslims and how they sort of competed in the context of colonial power. And in your presentation, which I found refreshing, the focus was really on the agency of the Jews and the Muslims, but the colonial power didn't seem to appear almost at all. And so I'm wondering, when you think about that, to what extent is this this environment, a product of a British colonial world? I mean, is this only possible because of British colonialism? And is there violence that is implicit that makes it possible without actually necessarily having to manifest?
Right. I mean, like your final sentences there are the key to the answer, and it's true, that is a key difference between French Algeria and British Egypt. Yeah, colonialism wasn't a monolith. There were many kinds of colonialisms in the plural. And French colonialism was, and especially in Algeria, which was particularly violent and intrusive, was nothing like British colonialism, especially in Egypt, where the British, especially and intentionally, didn't intrude as the French intruded in Algeria. So until the First World War, Egypt was still nominally a part of the Ottoman Empire. And even after the World War, or during the war, when the British declared Egypt a British protectorate, it soon gave Egypt its nominal independence in 1922 and 23. That meant that there was an Egyptian government there, and that that meant that there was a great deal of Egyptian agency in Egypt in an extent that wasn't even like dreamt of in French in French Algeria. So that is not to say that British colonialism wasn't there. It certainly was, and it made itself felt and present when it tried when it wanted to to cater to British imperial interests. Right, but the British limited themselves to those specific areas that they wanted in Egypt. So mainly economically, and the Suez Canal, and things like that. In other areas, they were pretty much hands off. That also meant that those large immigrant communities that were there in Egypt, including Jewish immigrants, most of them were not colonial immigrants. They were not colonial administrators, again, like the French in Algeria. These were work immigrants, many of whom came even before British occupation, who were attracted to Egypt by the economic situation in Egypt. Now, you can say that yes, the economic climate was beneficial for expatriates because of British colonialism, and that is very much true. But it is better seen as part of a long history of migrations to and from Egypt than in the context of colonial migration. So that is why the British that's why British colonialism is not very present in that story, the way that French colonialism is present in Algeria, although it's there, of course, but in the very distant background.
Excellent. We have a question from someone in Cairo. Thank you for your interesting talk. It is sad that the Jewish community in Cairo today is reduced to only 1 or 2 people. How large is the Egyptian community, Jewish community in Israel now? And then this sort of goes on to ask about other places that Egyptian Jews went after 1957. And also a question about whether communism played into the politics of sort of interfaith struggles in the 1930s and 40s.
Right. So about half of the Jewish community in Egypt migrated after in 3 or 4 distinctive waves. In 1948, 1957 was the main one, and then again in 1967 and 1973. That is really following the Egyptian-Israeli wars. So the Jewish community left or was pushed out of Egypt, and the common estimates talk about half of them migrating to Israel, and the rest to really all over the globe. You can find Jewish Egyptian communities in Australia, in France, in the United States, in Brazil. I think these are the main Jewish Egyptian communities that you can find today. And the second question was about communism.
Yeah, I don't totally understand it, but I think what they're asking is to what extent the tensions that existed between Jews and Muslims or the tensions or the persecution of the Jewish community that happened subsequent to 45, to what extent that was motivated by Jews being disproportionately represented among the communists. I think that was the question.
Right. Yeah. So yes, Jewish Egyptians, like many Jews in many other countries around the Middle East and North Africa, were among the founders and leadership and political activists of the Egyptian communist and socialist parties. Now, in that narrow context, the point or the vision of communism and communist parties, and the reason that Jews were attracted to those kinds of ideologies and political movement was exactly because they were religiously blind. Right, so they provided a platform where their Jewishness didn't matter or was even erased. So in that sense, there was a kind of cooperation between Jews and non-Jews in the context of the communist movement in Egypt, at least during its first years. Then there were, as often happened, many disagreements and differences over ideological lines, mainly the relationship between communism or global communism and local nationalism, and that's where things kind of frayed. But if look, like the Communist Party in Egypt was always like a fringe movement, and although like Jews were between like its founders and leaders, it was a very tiny number of Jews in the context of the whole Jewish community. So so its influence was limited, and as limited as it was rather a unifying ideology and political party, unifying across confessional lines rather than exacerbating tensions.
That's fascinating. The next question that we had was about Coptic Christians and to what extent their contemporary experiences in Egypt. There's been a flight of some Christians recently that's been reported, but that to what, I think the broader question is, to what extent does the Jewish experience and the Coptic experience in the Egyptian context, how do we explain the dissonances and how do we explain the similarities in terms of why there are still substantial Christian populations there, even if they some have chosen to leave even if there has been a small exodus recently.
That's a fascinating question that really awaits new research. Really, I can't think of anyone. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of anyone who has done that comparison. And it's really interesting. Well, I think that the key difference lies, first of all, in numbers. We have to remember that the Coptic community in Egypt is about 10% of all Egyptians. We're talking about millions of people here. And after all said and done, the Jewish community in Egypt was tiny, maybe. So the conservative estimates are about 65,000 people, but more likely we are talking about 80,000 or 100,000 tops Jews in Egypt. and size matters, and size matters. It does mean, for as I pointed out, that first of all, like this the small size of the Jewish communities was really amenable to the kind of social engineering that went on there, and it was also very easy to for them to disperse or being pushed out of Egypt in a way that you can't really do with the Copts in Egypt unless they themselves, choose to migrate. So that is we need to return to the basics in order to understand the differences there. But that's why I have emphasized I made it a point during my presentation to talk not about Jews and Muslims, but Jews, Christians, and Muslims, because I think that the kind of this urban history it really applies to all communities. So I see the social hierarchy, the class hierarchy. I see class as a more salient feature of Egyptian social life in the context that I was talking about, more than religious differences.
Fantastic. Kind of a couple of questions on the nature of the experience, what the expulsion or exodus or whatever you want to call it of Jews from Egypt. Can you speak to what that process was actually like? And a number of people commented that they didn't know about that. So why the story hadn't been well known, at least in an American Ashkenazi context, I think is the implication.
Right. So yeah, that's references. So it's very much talked about in well, at least Jewish communities from the Middle East, and the Israeli state is really pushing that narrative by national commemorations and efforts like that to drive the narrative of Jewish expulsion from the Middle East and North Africa. And the thing about that is, as as the Middle East and North Africa is not a monolith, the Jewish communities in the region are not a monolith. And while it's true that most of them dispersed from their countries of origin, and some of the communities were there for millennia, there's no one story of how Jews left the Middle East and North Africa. By the way, there are communities that never left, like Jews in Turkey and Iran. There were Jewish communities that were exterminated during the Holocaust, like the one in Salonika, the Algerian Jews, as you know, and Libyan Jews did suffer during the German occupation of those countries as well. Some of the communities were lifted by the newly established state of Israel, like the one in Yemen and in Iraq. Some left kind of by a mix of their own volition and push, like the Jewish community in Morocco, and some were deported. really deported, like the Jewish community in Egypt. And that has to do, again, because of the proximity of Egypt and Israel, and because Egypt and Israel went to war, and Egypt actually, with its newly established revolutionary regime in 1952, took upon itself to lead the Arab war effort against Israel in those years. So that affected the predicament of the Jewish community in Egypt a lot. Again, some Jews started to leave Egypt in 1948 because of those tensions caused by the war that I mentioned. But in 1948, it wasn't. It still wasn't a government policy to deport or push Jews out of Egypt. Things changed by 1957. There was a change of regime. Again, the Nasserite regime that took it upon itself to lead the Arab war effort against Israel. And by 1957, it was already a governmental policy to push Jews out. Some were outright deported, like, put in handcuffs and on ships out of Egypt. Many were arrested. Some were pushed out by various laws of sequestration of their property, dismissing them from work and jobs, and like really making their lives in Egypt like not viable. Right. So so the big wave came in 1957, and that repeated itself in 1967 and 1973. So that's that story in a nutshell.
I think you said it beautifully about there's no single defining experience, as you said, which is really, I mean, I like how you introduce contingency there, thinking about how these different places worked. And even though the end result in most places, with the exception of Turkey and Iran, is the same, the way that people got there is different. That was beautifully said. I have a thought experiment question. I want to continue to encourage people to send in questions. You talked about modernization and modern a number of times in your presentation, and sort of the old like Hakuati culture of like, and then this sort of modern cafe, which is also bars, and I'm wondering if you replace the word modernization with westernization and modern with Western, how would that change about it? So this may be another Foucauldian question about violence, but like, I mean, or about how power is functioning, but sort of like to what extent is modernization, westernization in this story? To what extent is are these elites grasping for to become European versus sort of asserting their own agency in this context?
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Also a very important question and much debated. First of all, yes. I mean, there's no denying, and it was like also like very explicit. It's not like something that like we scholars are saying about those social cultural processes. I mean, the players at that time and place also explicitly said that yes, Europe was a model for new cultural and social practices. The reason why I'm cautious with that term of Westernization is because of it has a very heavy baggage in public discourse outside scholarship, which makes it a little bit inaccurate, and I want it to be accurate. So I wanted to point my finger more on modernization than Westernization. It's inaccurate because, first of all, we need to remember that Europe and the West are also constructs. And they were, they were differently constructed in Europe and North America and the West, and Europe was constructed differently in the Middle East or in Egypt, right? So that's like for starters. Secondly, when you're talking about cultural exchange and an adaptation, that went on like for millennia. We like, again, speaking about constructs, Europe and the West, like being on the north of the Mediterranean and Egypt and North Africa on the south of it, and there's like a kind of like a conceptual border there. That's also kind of modern, like, and you must know it, Brandon, like better than me. There was like like in early modern and pre-modern times, there was a shared Mediterranean culture. And there's like cultural movement there like for millennia. So when, by the way, Europeans get coffee from Egypt, is that like an Easternization of Europe? What's that? So like not every cultural adaptation like needs to be talked about with that like burden of that, the political burden of like Westernization. And ultimately, I think that reading how Muslim Egyptians, Christian, Muslim and non-Muslim Egyptians, Jewish Egyptians were talking about cultural adaptation from Europe and the West, you really see that their emphasis is on modernization, on being modern. Well, in French colonial countries like Algeria, they did use the awful French word évoluer, the evolved to a hierarchy. That wasn't the term used in Egypt, but the point was the same, that yes, we Egyptians are now modernized and therefore deserve our independence from European control. There was also like a sense of like this modernization being like the global middle class and global modernity that Egyptian and other intellectuals were really buying into. So at the end of the day, yes, there's definitely no denying of like that part of modernity in the Middle East is European inspired or Western modeled, but we need to be careful about it, and we need to think about it as a local adaptation of Western models.
Excellent. Thank you. Still open to any more questions. I will selfishly take one more, and then if anyone else wants to call in, we have lots of people here, but not many questions coming in. So if you want to ask, please do. The question I would have is, as someone who's fascinated by this period, but knows relatively little. I did write an article on Al-Mahal al-Kubra for some reason in modern Egypt and its Jews. But generally speaking, the Jewish community that I know about, and the sort of the one that I think has gotten the most scholarly attention is the community of Alexandria, right? The expat community of Alexandria, not just Jews, but as you mentioned, Greeks and others. And so I'm wondering, what does this coffee shop look like if it's in Alexandria? In other words, what fundamental differences exist in the ways that the communities are interacting in a Cairene versus an Alexandrian context?
Great question. I was so focused on Cairo because it was more than enough to handle. So there were differences between the coffee house or social scene in Alexandria than in Cairo. Now, like, the funny thing is, yes, the common perception is that there were more so-called foreigners or immigrants in Alexandria than in Cairo, where that isn't true, by the way, demographically, statistically. But it is true, and maybe the reason why that common perception was emerged is because the so-called foreign, and again, what is foreign is another question. The so-called foreign presence in Alexandria was more conspicuous than in Cairo. As I think I mentioned during my presentation, almost at no point in time, except for Azbakia in the 1870s, there was no specific neighborhood in Cairo that had a majority of foreigners or immigrants, while in Alexandria there was. And again, as I've said, there wasn't like a particularly ethnic association of any coffee house in Cairo, but there was a Greek coffee house scene in Alexandria. Again, because of demographic concentration, right? You can talk about historical models like the port city, which Alexandria was and Cairo wasn't, and things like that. But I think that the key to the difference lies simply in demographic concentration, maybe. Other than that, I think a lot of the things apply the same to both places.
That's fascinating. I certainly had almost all of those misconceptions, so I appreciate you clarifying them. This has been a wonderful talk, a wonderful conversation. Alon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And and we hope to see you again here soon. And also thank you for joining us also at very, very late in the morning or late at night or early in the morning. Particularly grateful in that context. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Please, if you're interested in more programming like this, come go to the Strum Center website. We have the 10th annual Ladino Day coming up, which we're very excited about, as well as other events. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we really appreciate the time and your efforts to join us for the series. So have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.